Good day, everyone. We are assigned to report the Advanced Educational Psychology, Chapter 36, the Adjustment, Frustration, and Conflicts. Before I go on with the discussion, I would like to give my respect to our professor, Ma'am Nerissabeatriz, LPT, MAED, and RGC. The discussants of the report. My name is Cristel Pilorio, a private school teacher from Sipocat District, and my co-reporter, Ma'am Janeline C. Clavicilla, a teacher 1 from Tigaon District. So let's come now to the discussion of the report. These are the different definitions of conflict. Conflict is a painful emotional state which results from a tension between opposed and contradictory. A stage of tension brought by the presence in the individual of two or more opposing desires. State of affairs in which two or more incompatible behavior trends are evoked that cannot be satisfied fully at the same time. Conflict is usually a clash of motives. A group of psychologists determined that there are three types of conflict: the approach-approach conflict, the approach-avoidance conflict, and the avoidance-avoidance conflict. So let's talk about the first type of conflict, the approach-approach conflict. The approach-approach conflict is when there's conflict within a person where he or she needs to decide between two appealing goals. The conflict is typically resolved when there's movement towards one of the goals. This makes it easier to make the final decision. For example, during vacation, it's time to plan your family vacation for the year. Not shockingly, the kids are leaning towards the Disney World vacation. You and your spouse are leaning towards the tropical beach vacation in Hawaii. Each option has advantages and disadvantages. It's your job as a parent to make the decision. This falls under approach-approach conflict because you have to decide between two pretty appealing destinations. You begin researching the Disney vacation and see all the fun things the whole family can experience. This leads you to set up a schedule for the entire week. By the time you're ready to move on to researching the beach vacation, you've already got your mind set on the Disney vacation. The decision is made. The next type of conflict is approach-avoidance conflict. Approach-avoidance conflict occurs when an individual is faced with a decision to pursue or avoid something that has advantages and disadvantages. This form of conflict involves only one goal. The name comes from the advantages of the goal making the person want to approach the goal and the disadvantages making him or her want to avoid it. Finding the equilibrium. So the approach-avoidance conflict is known to cause stress. People go back and forth trying to make a decision. So they are trying to find their equilibrium point where they are about to accept both the advantages and the disadvantages, no matter the final decision. As the person nears the goal, they feel a pull from the disadvantaged side. This leads the person to avoid the goal. As the person starts to pull away, they feel the pull from the advantage side to approach the goal. So the person eventually reaches their equilibrium point. So the equilibrium point po, ito po yung nasa gitna. An example of approach-avoidance conflict: your boss recently approached you and offered you a promotion. How exciting! The new position comes with a $10,000 raise and a new title. However, you also learned that you will be required to work an additional 10 hours per week and travel out of town 1 weekend per month. Now, you have a conflict going on in your mind. You aren't sure what to do. There are both advantages and disadvantages involved in this single goal. You start thinking about the disadvantages and avoid making the decision. You go back and forth until you meet your equilibrium point and make a final decision. The third type of conflict is avoidance-avoidance conflict. Avoidance-avoidance is a common type of conflict where one must choose between two choices, each of which is undesirable. So I will be reading a situation as an example to better understand this type of conflict. For example, Laura had been relatively healthy her entire life. Unfortunately, even with the state of modern health, she knew that at the age of 65, she might start to develop some medical problems. So, Laura went to her primary care physician and asked for a complete physical examination. Sitting in the doctor's office after the exam, Laura could sense that something was wrong. Her doctor informed her that he detected a lump in her breast. Although he was going to conduct a biopsy to make sure, he was concerned that she might have breast cancer. Given her family history, Laura was concerned that she might have breast cancer too. She knew that whatever choices should be given would be undesirable. However, she would have to make a choice regardless. So Laura was facing what is known as an avoidance-avoidance conflict, whereby an individual wants to avoid making a decision because the alternatives are objectionable. So after Laura's doctor received her biopsy results, he presented her with two possible courses of action. They could try to reduce the tumors using chemotherapy, or they could perform a double mastectomy and possibly avoid chemotherapy altogether. Neither decision offered a sure cure, and neither approach was going to be easy. Whether Laura chooses surgery or chemotherapy, she will experience pain. She knows that she has to make a decision, but is facing a conflict because both options have significantly negative consequences. So there are elements of avoidance. For example, avoidance may allow an individual to, first, wait and see if he or she will have better options in the future. Second, carefully consider a decision. Third, consult the wisdom of others. And the fourth one, conduct additional research. So in the case of Laura, may dalawang negative consequences. Neither maganda, kaya pwedeng pumasok po dito yung elements of avoidance. Whereas, ito po yung pwede niyang maging decision. Maghintay siya para magkaroon ng mas magandang option sa future, para magkaroon siya ng mas magandang desisyon, magkonsulta sa iba, or mag-conduct ng ibang research or additional information. Let's come now to the discussion of defense or mental mechanism. These are the definitions according to various authors. So defense or mental mechanism tend to resort certain mechanism for defending our inadequacies of anxieties. According to page 1976, when psychological equilibrium is threatened by severe emotional trauma, the mind resorts to a variety of protective subterfuges and debtors. While according to Carroll, 1967, it is a device assorted to in order to achieve an indirect satisfaction of a need so that tension will be reduced and self-respect maintained. While according to Arkoff, 1968, it is a certain pattern of behavior that are employed for protection against threat or anxiety. And according to Davison, 1978, defense or mental mechanism is a strategy unconsciously utilized that serves to protect the ego from anxiety. So let's now tackle about the nature of defense mechanism. The nature of defense mechanism is that they are devices in the form of a certain pattern of behavior. Second, they provide the protection against whatever threatens our ego or self-esteem. Third, they help us defend ourselves from possible injury and delicate moments. So mahalaga po si defense mechanism dahil ito ay tumutulong sa atin upang tayo ay makaiwas sa kapahamakan. So these are the most common defense mechanism. First is rationalization. Rationalization is trying to give socially acceptable reasons for unacceptable social behavior. Rationalization is interpreting behavior in acceptable and reasonable way. Example, a student might blame a poor exam score on the instructor rather than his or her lack of preparation. So yung estudyante, dahil hindi siya nag-aral, nakakuha siya ng mababang exam. Ngunit, biniblame niya sa instructor yung mababang exam niya dahil sa mababang ang score. The next example is someone who didn't get a promotion at work might say they didn't want the promotion anyways. So parang dinadahilan niya pa na ayaw niya naman nung promotion kaya okay lang na hindi siya ma-promote. The next common defense mechanism is projection. So projection is taking our own unacceptable qualities or feelings and ascribing them to other people. Projection works by allowing the expression of the desire or impulse, but in a way that the ego cannot recognize, therefore reducing anxiety. Example, if you have a strong dislike for someone, you might instead believe that he or she does not like you. Yung projection po is more psychological. Kasi, yung dahil ayaw mo dun sa tao, feeling mo ayaw rin niya sa'yo, kaya inaayawan mo siya. Parang ganun po. The next common defense mechanism, the third one, is denial. Denial describes situations in which people seem unable to face reality or admit an obvious truth. Example, he's in denial. Denial functions to protect from things that the individual cannot cope with. While this may save us from anxiety or pain, denial also requires a substantial investment of energy. Because of this, other defenses are also used to keep this unacceptable feeling from consciousness. We refuse to accept reality because it hurts or we don't like it. For example, after the unexpected death of a loved one, a person might refuse to accept the reality of the death and deny that anything has happened. Iba po meron talaga yung in denial ng mga tao na kapag nawalan sila ng mahal sa buhay, dinideny nila na sinasabi nila, hindi pa siya, nandito pa siya. Hindi siya nawala. Yung mga ganun po. The fourth common defense mechanism is repression. Repression is an unconscious mechanism employed by the ego to keep disturbing or threatening thoughts from becoming conscious. Repression acts to keep information out of conscious awareness. These memories don't just disappear, they continue to influence our behavior. Example, a person who has repressed memories of abuse suffered as a child may later have difficulty forming relationships. Dahil nga nagkakaroon siya ng anxiety, dahil dun sa pag-suffer niya during childhood, nagkakaroon ng parang trust issues. The fifth common defense mechanism is regression. This is a movement back in psychological time when one is faced with stress. Regression, retreat for an individual from the complexities of the present to an earlier and simpler form of behavior or a more fortunate and pleasant period of life. Our fear to act like adults and our wish to return to our childhood where everything was taken care of magically. Example, an adult curling up in a fetal position when feeling threatened or afraid. So, dito po sa regression, parang gusto nating bumalik sa pagkabata. Dahil pagbata daw, walang problema. The sixth common defense mechanism is displacement. Displacing or shifting of thoughts from one person or situation to another. Transferring emotion from situation to another situation. Displacement is a defense mechanism that involves an individual transferring negative feelings from one person or thing to another. Example: a person who is angry at their boss may take out their anger on a family member by shouting at them. So sa halimbawa po, yung boss mo, pinapagalitan ka, sinisigawan ka, then yung negative energy parang naiiwan po sa sarili natin, then pag uwi natin, parang maibabaling natin yun sa ibang tao. Pwedeng sa family, pwedeng sa friends, or sino pa man na makasalubong mo na pwedeng magpainit ng ulo mo. The seventh common defense mechanism is fantasy and daydreaming. Withdrawal of one's self in a private and satisfying world of imagination, thus instead of facing the realities, he may become satisfied with unreal, imaginary success or satisfaction. Example: a student who is repeatedly bullied at school may retreat into a fantasy world based on their favorite movie. They spend their time in this fantasy world and may begin to suffer social problems due to not spending time with friends, and their schoolwork may begin to suffer as well. Dahil nga, lagi na lang silang nandun sa fantasy world nila dahil doon, parang safe place po yun para sa kanila. So this is fantasy and daydreaming. The eighth common defense mechanism is sublimation. So sublimation is a sign of maturity that allows people to function normally in socially acceptable ways. When we transform our negative emotions or instincts mainly to acceptable behavior and positive action. Example: a person experiencing extreme anger might take up a kickboxing or boxing as a means of venting frustration. So, another example, pwedeng sipa-sipain yung mga can or kung anong mga makita mo, bote, or kung anong makita mo dyan, sinisipa-sipat. So, yun po ay ang example ng sublimation. So, the last common type of defense mechanism is intellectualization. So, intellectualization is thinking about events in a cold, clinical way. It allows us to avoid thinking about stressful, emotional aspect of the situation and instead focus only the intellectual component. For example, a person who has just been diagnosed with a terminal illness might focus on learning everything about the disease in order to avoid distress and remain distant from the reality of the situation. So instead na isipin niya yung negative, ang ginagawa niya lang niya is pinag-aaralan niya na lang na mabuti yung disease na meron siya para maiwasan niya yung pag-iisip ng mga negative thoughts. So that is the last common defense mechanism, the intellectualization. So before I end my report, I would like to share a quotation from Dorothy Thompson. She quoted that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of creative alternatives for responding to conflict. Alternatives to passive or aggressive responses, alternative to violence. So that concludes my report. The next topic will be discussed by my co-reporter, Ma'am Jenny Lynn. That will be all. Thank you so much and God bless.
Good day, everyone. I am Janeline Gravisilia, co-reporter of Ma'am Crystal Lorio. My assigned topic is all about frustration and adjustment. What is frustration? Frustration is a condition of being thwarted in the satisfaction of motive. This is also an emotional tension resulting from the blocking of a desire or need. This is also the feeling of being blocked, thwarted in satisfying a need of attaining a goal that individual perceives as significant. Frustration occurs when goals is black. Frustration lies both in the individual and his environment. Frustration results from mental tension. There are two causes of frustration. Number one is the external or environmental. Number two is the internal or personal. Let us discuss first the external or environmental. Under these causes of frustration, these are the natural calamities. Another is the social factors such as norms and rules of society. Next, these are the economic factors such as poverty or wages. And lastly, the corruption. Number two causes of frustration is the internal or personal. Under these causes is the physical defeat or abnormality. Next, the mental deficiency. Next, conflicting desires. Next is the moral values. And lastly is the high level of aspiration. Let's now come to adjustment. This is the process by which living organism maintain a balance between its need and the circumstances. This is also the continual process by which a person varies his behavior to produce a more harmonious relationship between himself and environment. This is also the psychological survival in much the same way as biologists uses the term adaptation to describe physiological survival. Different meaning of adjustment as are follows. Adjustment is a continual process by which a person varies his behavior to produce a more harmonious relationship between himself and environment, and that was according to Gates, Gerseld, and others in 1970. Adjustment is a continual outcome of the individual's attempt to deal with stress and meet his needs, and also his effort to maintain harmonious relationship with the environment. This is also the psychological survival in much the same ways as biologists uses the term adaptation to describe physiological survival according to Van Aller 1970. Adjustment is a process that takes us to lead a happy and well-contented life. It also helps us to keeping balance between our needs and the capacity to meet these needs. Adjustment proceeds us to change our way of life according to the demands of the situation. Adjustment gives us strength and ability to bring desirable changes in the condition of our environment. Here are the characteristics of adjustment. Adjustment helps us to keep balance between our needs and the capacity to meet these needs. Adjustment implies changes in our thinking and way to the demands of the situation. It gives us ability and strength to desirable changes in the state of our environment. Adjustment is a psychosociological as well as psychological. It is also multidimensional. Adjustment learns as happiness and contentment. A well-adjusted person are free from physical ailment, psychological comfort, no psychological diseases or depression or anxiety, social acceptance, self-understanding about assets and limitations, self-respect, balanced level of aspiration, strong willpower, healthy attitude and interest, emotionally controlled, intellectually developed. Also, we can say that a person is well adjusted when he or she is physically adjusted. awareness of one's own strengths and limitation, flexibility of his behavior, satisfaction of the basic needs, does not process critical or fault-finding attitude, capable of struggling with odd circumstances, realistic perception of the world, feeling at home with his surroundings, and an adequate philosophy of life. Contrary to the adjustment, maladjustment is a degree of disharmony between the individual and the environment. Maladjustment results from frustration and conflict. Individual struggles between his abilities and capacities and his environment. It indicates the failure of the individual to adjust to a situation. Here are the symptoms of maladjustment. Number 1 is the nervous disorders such as fear, anxiety, and phobia. Next, habits disorders such as speech, sleep. Next is the behavior disorders such as unmanageable, aggression, and truancy. Next is the educational, the backwardness in discipline, concentration, and inability to keep jobs. And here are the process of adjustment. An adjustment mechanism is a device used by the individual to achieve satisfaction of the need indirectly. This helps in reducing tension and distress and maintaining self-respect. Next, compensation. Individual attempt to cover up his weakness in one area by exhibiting his strength. Next, identification. Individual attempts to identify himself with successful person to hide his own failures. A student identify himself with his father and talk about his success. Another process of adjustment is the rationalization. This is the shifting of responsibility for. Then, the projection. This is the tendency to push out upon another person's one's own unrelated, frustrated ambitions. And lastly, the daydreaming. These are the imaginative fulfillment of life. There are adjustment program in school. And number 1 is the achievement testing, interpretation, and follow-up. Next is the diagnostic testing. Next is the identification and analysis of adjustment behavior. Next is the variety and instructional methods. Next, individual and remedial work. And lastly, the counseling. There are 2 types of spheres of adjustment, the personal adjustment and the social adjustment. Under the personal adjustment are adjustment to physical development and health. Next, adjustment with regard to mental development and health. Next, emotional adjustment. Next, sexual adjustment. And lastly, adjustment with respect to the individual needs. Under the social adjustment are the home and family adjustment. These are the adjustment with friends and relatives. This is also the adjustment with neighbors and other members of the community. And also, there are occupational adjustment. Under this is the no regret about the choice of work or occupation. Demonstrate a job satisfaction through the performance of duties. Satisfied with working condition. Get along well with colleagues and official world. Positive attitude towards the work. And engaging and bringing necessary improvement and modification in work. And that was all about our topic. Thank you for listening.